Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Creative Mornings Columbus. I'm your host, David Staley, and we begin every month, always, by thanking our global sponsors, MailChimp and Skillshare. You saw that in our slide. And I always want to thank our local sponsors, Beam Dental, and another sponsor that we're going to learn a little bit more about this morning. So I'm very pleased to introduce this morning Jonathan Moody. As many of you here in Columbus know, he's the president and CEO of the Columbus-based architecture firm, Moody Nolan. The firm's designs have won more than 330 design citations, including 49 from the American Institute of Architects and 45 from the National Organization of Minority Architects. And notably, Moody Nolan was selected as the 2021 AIA National Architecture Firm Award recipient, the highest honor achieved through the American Institute of Architects. Moody Nolan is not only the first Ohio-based firm to win this award, but the first African-American-owned firm to receive this recognition. A former designer at Canon Design and at Eisenman Architects, Jonathan's background is focused on 3D visual presentation and digital fabrication. Most recently, he has worked on a variety of civic, sports, education, healthcare, and institutional projects. And Moody Nolan has been an indefatigable sponsor of Creative Mornings Columbus, for which we are grateful. Speaking this morning on the theme home, please join me in welcoming this morning Jonathan Moody.
Oh, thank you. I now have a word I need to Google to be sure. Indefatigable.
Man. Indefatigable,
Yeah.
Inexhaustible, enthusiastic.
Wow. All right, that's for Google for later. I hope I spelled it right in my notes. But yeah, so thanks. It's so great to be here. Thanks for a warm introduction and warm welcome for everybody. And thanks for so many familiar names I can see at least listed or pictures. So I'm supposed to talk about home, and I'm an architect, so I couldn't help but at least because it can be so broad, not even knowing where to start. And having so much possibilities about where to start. But I had to go back to, architectural theory courses and questioning even who were the first architects that define home. And for another discussion is about maybe Daedalus and the maze. And maybe that was a home for the Minotaur, in terms of maybe the first record of an architect. But, way back when, in architectural theory course, we talked about the idea of idicular form. Right. And I do not want to go into detail about that, but, originally, thinking about primal needs for shelter, and, idicular form was kind of the beginnings of thinking about not kind of a found place of shelter, right? Where, cave people would say, if I found a place where I could cover myself, I didn't necessarily create it. But an idicule is, literally from Roman times of, defined an idicula as a small shrine, which I think many of us can relate to the idea of what, we see our own small shrines and what that means. But I did also challenge myself a bit today. I know Creative Mornings has evolved a bit and in terms of how content is presented and talked about, but I do feel that graphics can be a crutch for myself at times, as to say, oh man, if I can just enamor people with pretty pictures, I don't have to actually say much of anything. But I am a bit dependent on them. So I've decided that I will not use graphics, but I will use hand gestures. And I think you'll understand what I mean by that as we go through this. So, and you'll hear a little bit about kind of the story of many homes and many places, and we'll just get through what this idea means. So I'm going to start with, in thinking about an idicula or a small shrine, the home I grew up in. And so this is the gesture we'll start with, when we think about an idicule, and you can all just mentally even imagine that a home icon or emoji, but this kind of idea of home, the home I grew up in. My father's an architect. He is one who, he loves to design his own homes. I do not, different conversation, but he built a home into a hillside on Sunbury Road. I lived there for 18 years, but that place was always different. And what I mean from that is this is, maybe the difference between a house and a home. The original house we built was, he said he built it into the hillside. He found this property, and he asked, our neighbors who lived behind us if it was okay to build a house in front of them, and built again into the hillside would save on energy costs and other things. And I grew up in that house, lived there for a while. And then at some point, maybe I feel like I was in elementary school, we got to build an addition. So I'm living in this house, and then next to us is this addition, and our driveway is all under construction and all that stuff, but lived in that house growing up. And then maybe later towards, I think around high school was when it was kind of inverted. So we had an original house addition, and then it was like, all right, well, we have to renovate the old part, and we kind of have to move everything onto the other side so that we can renovate the old part. And I do think that was a good process to witness sometimes what we put our clients through in terms of, having to go through a renovation. And, even though we're living in one house in one place, and that is my home growing up, it was kind of 3 different versions of it, and it became all of one thing. But then, after I'd grown up, it was, time to, transition to a new home. So I remember I got accepted into Cornell. That's a whole long story. And then I got to go up for a summer college program. And I remember that was, my parents came up and they dropped me off and they make sure I got everything moved in. At least, and this was just for a summer, a 6-week program. And I had a great time, but that was the first time I lived anywhere like for a long time, 6 weeks away from home for the summer. And then summer came back, I had a great time. And I started football workouts over that summer. And it was decided that I would come back for fall camp to play football. And that was a completely oh yes, go Big Red. That was a completely different experience. And that was where I would really say the idea of transition of home became more of a place, right? Not a house. Home was becoming a place where I was living. And the reason I say that, it was a bit traumatic. The time I really arrived on campus for fall camp, and because I didn't go through, say, a normal process of recruitment, I didn't live with other football players. I lived with another architecture major, but it was fall camp, so I had to get there early. So I got there maybe a month before any other students arrived on campus. And this time, instead of the warm, like, hey, let's make sure you're settled and comfortable, this was a goodbye at the airport, at Columbus Airport from my parents, which was like, oh, okay, it's fine, but I've been there before. But then I get to campus and I get all my stuff moved in, but I'm by myself and I'm there early. None of my roommates have arrived. And it was that night, like when you close the door, and I'm like, holy crap, like it's so quiet. I'm here by myself. And that was kind of when it really hit me of like, oh man, I'm here in this place. I don't know if this is going to be my home, but I'm here in this place. And I don't know if it's going to fit for a while. And it did not help. I think I got through, football was enough to occupy enough of my mind and time to kind of get through that. But then classes started in the fall. And every freshman is required to take a freshman writing course. And I remember taking one, and I was really excited about it. But then all of a sudden, the first assignment was to write about home. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that was when, you're talking like, I'm full homesick. I hate it here. I don't like this place. But I know what I need to do. I can't wait till I can get back to like my real home in this place. But Ithaca is a beautiful place. And I survived the 5 years I was there. And then I had another bumpy transition. It was a summer between my undergrad and grad school. Sorry, this annual. So it's like they're so fascinated. That's a part of my home here. But my kids trying to join the conversation. But
they are welcome to join, Jonathan.
Yeah, yes. But another bumpy transition. And it was, I had the summer where the interesting thing was that summer between undergrad and grad school, I was actually teaching that intro course that I'd gone through while the summer I was there. And I was TAing that course while I was finishing my thesis book, and then I was going to start grad school at UCLA. And I remember it was the students' final reviews were on a Friday, and I finished my thesis book that Friday. I had to meet the parents and do like a "hey, your kid's great" kind of thing on Saturday. And then I think, yes, Saturday I drove back to Columbus, which is about a 6-hour drive. Oh, I forgot my hand gesture. Oh, this is where home is more over here, right? Like home exists at a distance, right? That was, sorry, I forgot that one. That was the second hand gesture. But then, so Saturday Saturday met the parents, drove back to Columbus. Sunday, flight to LA, and Monday was the start of grad school. So that was quite an abrupt transition, and I did not have this kind of home. And home went from being like over here, like 7 hour drive, to like 6-hour flight home way over here. And it was becoming more of a memory where I could remember all the things I associated with home. And because I didn't have this kind of home, I was living on couches until I could find this kind of home. And then, so it was at that point when I was living in California, and, with the cost of living being so much different, I was questioning what are all the things I remember and associate with my home. And even like the idea of what parts of community are in my home? Do I have a church home? Do I have a place to, what are all the things that I remember about home? But that's kind of home being more of a memory. But I was in grad school for a year. It was a very, quick program. And then I worked for a while and lived in many small apartments where I would say I questioned, creating memories and creating, the importance of what was home. And then even in, when I could only afford, like, say, a 350 square foot studio apartment, it was a big question about what are the essentials of my home and what do I remember that I like about my home. But then it has literally been about 10 and a half years when it was 11 years or so when I got a call from my dad asking if I was ever planning to move back home. Ha ha ha. And I said sooner or later, and he said sooner or later should be sooner. And then I remember around Christmas of 10 and a half years ago, I was enamored. I just didn't know the difference in cost of living. So it was just really an amazing, like, wow, I can afford a house. I mean, literally this big, like literally everything I owned fit in this room back here. And I'm like, I have to buy a house again. So we're kind of coming back. And then it was becoming this giant space, right? So I've been in here for 10 years. And then it became an exercise of beginning to think about what I want to fill that home with, right? And now it became, more things associated with it. And how do I begin not to define home for me, but how do I define it for others? And be kind of layering on what are the things that I associated with the house I grew up in? What are the things I associated with the places I've lived, right? What are the things that I remember about my childhood and, the experiences I had growing up? And how do I begin to define that for, my family in this house, right? Like, how do I begin to fill this house? And you can see junk and stuff on the wall. You can see, if you look really hard, like a little basketball hoop, there's degrees that I, from school that I, that begin to associate the memories. But then it's an exercise of filling the space with things that I associate with home. And, sometimes in what I started, realizing at that point in my life, so about 10 years ago, is that, home is not this physical thing, right? Like, home is beginning to become all these things I associate with it. Sometimes it's just the people I'm around. And so I got married and moved into a house, and we're filling this house with things that we are questioning what we want to be for our kids in terms of that home. But, and then that's really where I would say, the journey as, how does architecture come back into this? Because this is a physical space, and there are many physical spaces that we associate it, but over and over again, and maybe I have to do it for myself, but constantly reminding myself that we design buildings, but at the end of the day, nobody really cares about the building. It's never been about the building, right? It's, it's this place where we create memories that we define. And as architects, we constantly help people to redefine their homes and define what it means. And if somebody is asking you to design a house, you're trying to help them, through that journey of defining what home means for them. And so, and ultimately what it gets to is beyond the building, right? Is, the home becomes the physical boundary or the physical place, or the kind of back to this definition of what a home is, right? But then, the home is where your heart is, kind of thing, right? But then a home, and this is another one, is a place that exists in your mind to a degree. And when you ask your questions about like, how are you redefining, or how do you want to define a physical space that you associate with all these things, it gives you the opportunity to reflect on what you value, right? Like, what are the values that are most important? Because we all know, no matter how much money anybody has, you can never have everything. So, in your mind, what are the most important things that define what you value? And, I couldn't help, I have to go there at least to a degree. But, a lot of us have been asking, the last 16 months, we've been redefining and reevaluating what it is we value, and what it is we value in a home, what it is we value, what does shelter in place mean when you don't have shelter, right? Like, and you can't even get to this, you can't even talk about what it means in your heart, let alone in your mind, if there's no physical space. But we are questioning a lot of what we value. And I heard an economist talk about a K-shaped economy, and K-shaped meaning, for many of us, things have been fine this last year, and we've been kind of going the upward arc of the K. But for so many people, they've been on that downward arc of the K. And, as things have moved forward, it's, things have gotten worse. And here in Central Ohio, I think I do believe we're still on the cusp of what I would say is a housing crisis. Of all of the same challenges we had before still exist, in terms of the need for, to provide shelter and to help create, homes for people. And it is physical buildings, but we are constantly asking the deficiency that we have in those physical buildings. What does it mean if we're not filling that need? And what does it say about what we value in those things? And even recently, I think one of the things that's been talked about as, you see my kids in the, you can't see them, and you probably didn't hear them, but kids being at home with us, like our association with, maybe me feeling obligated to protect my parents, right? In this last year, saying, hey, we had a small bubble, but all of a sudden we have so many different generations together in one home. And it means different things for us at different points in our lives, either growing up or kind of reaching back down. And, so, and as we think, I think ahead about where my parents are, and, we all had that oh, we'll retire and downsize, but you want to have the space so that my kids still feel that they have a home there, right? And that they can go there and feel the memories associated with that. And it got even broader in connecting back to the memories of some of these places. Like my wife and kids just spent a month in California with their mother-in-law, their grandparents. And I think right now we're still redefining and questioning, what the values are. And, the idea that was crazy 2 years ago, but now it's not so crazy. It's do we have an Ohio home and a California home? And so that they can be associated with both and have the connection to the people that they associate with home. And I'm constantly asking, what does it mean for them? And what does it mean for my kids? And will they always have a home as they grow up to come back to? So, I mean, I think you've kind of touched on a lot of different ideas. But I guess what I would hope, everybody knows, and we've all talked about it and seen, but, this idea of home is definitely a journey. I think nobody believes, well, the difference between a house, a place, a memory, a community, a space, is something that is not just one place. It's many places altogether. And I do believe that constantly through conversation, through activity, through all the things that we do, and when we talk about what the value is of it, it is something that we constantly redefine, in terms of what our home is. And I think that is kind of a going forward, the disruption that we've faced this last year. I think we are all obligated to question how we define what is the place that we find the most value, and that we identify as home, and how do we redefine it each day. So that kind of gets back to the what is this home in your mind kind of thing, right? From my home being, a place like this, it's over here, it's further away. It's, the people that I associated, like I feel at home with my wife and kids and parents and grandparents. But it always is something that mentally, I have to be redefining and rethinking what it means. As in my job, I have to define it and redefine it for others. That's all I got. So I feel at home here. Maybe is that a fair?
Well, you say that's all you got. Boy, you packed an awful lot, Jonathan, I have to tell you. Well, that was just fantastic, and I so appreciate you sort of starting back in history. As an historian, I'm always appreciative of that. uh, Always time for Q&A. If you've questions or comments, as some of you have already started here, please put these in the chat. We will curate these. Jonathan, I'd like you to first of all start. You had said something in the beginning of your talk that you don't like to design your own home, and you said, but that's another story. Okay. You got to share that story.
Okay. The interesting thing is I was actually talking about that with someone this morning. I think there might be similar personality traits, but maybe people accept it differently. In that, architecture is or just design is just a space of criticism, right? And sometimes people feel like you never can turn off the criticism of like what could be better, or I don't like this detail, I don't like the way that window sits, I don't like I'm looking at like a stair, like a railing detail in my house that I'm like, I don't like. But my dad is more in the and so since I left home, right, or left that house, he's done 4 different homes, right?
Wow.
Because that's how he processes the criticism of improvement. I'm more of I have to be able to separate myself from the criticism of that I criticize myself. And when I'm at home, I want at least one space where I can blame somebody else for something that's not right. So that's how I respond to it instead. Because if I were to design my own house, I feel like I would constantly walk around and be like, well, why didn't I do that? Or why didn't I do this? Or why was that drawn that way? Or why isn't this room shaped that? Or like I was literally looking at a closet and bathroom kind of back up and like, wouldn't it have been better to have 6 extra inches in the closet versus the bathroom? I feel more comfortable being able to criticize someone else's work when I'm at home than to have to criticize myself.
I just love that. That's fantastic. Stacy, I'd like you to elaborate with what you wrote here. I think this is a great insight. COVID has provided us a glimpse into what home is for our colleagues. Do you tell us a little more? Because I think I know exactly what you mean by this.
No, I just think that it's really interesting. We all got thrown into this virtual environment, but for the first time ever, a lot of us are getting a glimpse into what home is for our colleagues. And at first, and Jonathan can attest to this, I just had, this week, my kids melding down in the background of a phone call. And we were kind of talking about it afterwards. I'm like, oh my gosh, that was really embarrassing, but it's sort of par for the course at this point. And so, we have gotten literal glimpses into what, we all fill our homes with and what our colleagues choose to fill their homes with, which is been a really interesting perspective, and you kind of learn more about all of us on a personal level and get to meet each other's families as well as the pets. So in some ways, disconnecting in person and literally disconnecting has brought us closer. And then the last thing I'll add is across all of our various office locations. So I work for Moody Nolan. So across all of our various office locations, it's sort of like leveled the playing field for all of us, because most of us are in Columbus. And whereas we may not have always been or had the ability to connect more personally with people in our other offices, this has allowed us that opportunity to do so.
I've remarked on this in previous Creative Mornings. Do you remember, like it was like 3 or 4 years ago that that fellow that was being interviewed on the BBC at a time when doing an interview over Zoom or Skype or something like that was still sort of new, and he's doing it obviously from a home study or home bedroom or something, and his kids started to come into the room, and then there was this the terrified mother trying to stay out of camera range and all that, and of course that went viral. And now in the age of COVID, kids, Jonathan has his kids there, they're clearly off camera. We've all been on the Zoom call with the cats that comes across and wants to share. It's just sort of become natural. And I agree with Stacy. It has afforded us the opportunity to at least get a glimpse of people's homes, in as much as we haven't put up the artificial screens and things behind us. I know that Autumn likes maps, for instance. Yeah, Jonathan?
Yeah, go ahead, Stacey.
No, I was going to say, we probably should all let go of the virtual backgrounds today as we're talking about home.
Yeah, maybe. But then, that touches on something else that's always, because some people don't want others, to see, and that's part of what the virtual background, or it's been a challenge with, I know a lot of school systems where some kids are like, I don't want anybody to see where else I live. But I think what has been, forced on us, some of us, we're excited about it. Some of us maybe not. But some of these ideas, and maybe and I don't mean to separate, but if we separate home, right, and we talk about house or work or job, right, those were things that we had a tendency to put borders on them, right, and we began to unintentionally say that work was that building, right, job was that place, and the idea that we had been talking about, the need for to see ourselves as whole people and not as I'm this person at home at my house, I'm this person in the car, I'm this person on my job. It's no, you're one person. And the forcing of us to kind of break down those boundaries, even if it's just digitally, says that there's a reality of no, while I'm at home I can work, and along with that all these other things that were associated, if you look really hard, and this when you could probably see the reflection of my son playing Nintendo, but that's a part of my life, and that's a part of my whole person. And so when you think about the work-life integration, it kind of forced us to break down those boundaries. But I think the positive in it is we see each other, even though it's a little box, right, we see each other as more complete people. And and then something that architects, we question those boundaries, right? I think that's part of what we're struggling with right now, in terms of, I think I heard the mayor this morning making his pitch for downtown, saying everybody's got to come back downtown and come back to work. But I think the retort to it is work can be anywhere, home can be anywhere. Why do we have to be in a physical place to congregate or commune? We're struggling through it.
Rod, you asked a similar sort of question that I was going to ask. So why don't you raise it here again for Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I've long been a fan of architecture. In fact, I've always felt that I was a frustrated, but fortunately not architect because I'd be a starving one. Anyway, and I wonder how much of your work in architecture you feel is your responsibility to express your own personal vision of architecture and design versus responding to your clients' definition of what their home might be and what would work for them as a home. In other words, how much do you see is your sort of dedication to a pure vision of design versus the seeking out what the problems are you have to solve, or defining a vision unique to your clients versus to your own vision? And how do you balance those two?
It's always a struggle. That is the truth. It's always a struggle to find the balance. And I think part of where the struggle lies is differentiating between ownership and expertise. And what I mean by that is, although there might be a certain level of expertise and knowledge about, say, history of architecture and tectonics and things that work and don't work, but then at the end of the day, it's like, but I'm not, as a designer, I'm never the owner. Well, not very often the owner, right? There are cases, right, where you can be the designer and the owner at the same time. So at the end of the day, it's a you own it, right? How do I help you fulfill your vision? Where it becomes more complex is when you broaden the idea of ownership. And if we'll start with house, right? But it's like, hey, this is my house, I own it. But that house exists within a neighborhood, within a community, within an urban context. And all of those things would say, well, this is our neighborhood, this is our community, and this is our context. So we all want, and so, when the conversation broadens, it becomes a difficult balance of who owns it, right? And who has the right to define it. And that's where, it's trying to find the balance of expertise, saying, I can hear all of these voices and I can listen, and I have to help prioritize whose voice is kind of, should be kind of weighted with the technical, like, man, I know you really, I know you really would love to put, a water fountain on top of your roof. Putting water, onto a thing that's one of the most important jobs is to shed water. Probably not the best, it's a trying to help them. But at the end of the day, I think architects were trying to find more ways to have ownership in the process and not just be kind of a service that we come and provide and leave. But at the same time, there's a very real, 20 years, I won't be living here. I won't own this. So, someone else has to be comfortable with the decisions we help them to get to.
Jonathan, you had sort of briefly raised this, just as, in fact, just as I was making the note to myself, but I was sort of thinking through the words homeless and homelessness. And I'm just curious what this means to you as an architect, because when we think of the problem of homelessness, we tend to think of it as a sort of a socioeconomic problem. I wonder how you think about, or given what you've talked about here today, what homelessness or being homeless means to you.
Well, I think that's where the reality of like a house comes into it, or house, apartment, structure, shelter, right? Whatever it is, because as much as for all of us who have a place where we can shelter, right? We can, kind of wax poetic about, some of these subjective ideas of like, memory or connections or people in community, because we have the luxury of saying, hey, I have all these basic needs met. So therefore I can think about these other things. But and those things still exist if you don't have a shelter, right? But there's still some fundamental, it really kind of goes back to that, that early, cave, association thing of like, if I can't even meet my basic human needs, right? How can I even begin to associate that next level? Maybe it's like kind of a Maslow's hierarchy thing. It's like, we can't talk about some of the social or emotional traits if we can't get past the basic need part. And that's where I do think, we have to get past the, what we end up, talk about like paralysis by analysis. Like the problem feels so big that we, more often than not do nothing, which we understand why, because, mentally the problem's too big for us to solve individually. But there is a need to constantly not kind of ignore it or brush it aside. We have to talk about it, or we have to address it in whatever ways that we can.
Yeah, you've spent a good part of this morning talking about home as being as much about people and relationships as it is about sort of a physical structure. And you just got me thinking about homelessness as sort of the absence or the fraying maybe of people and relationships. I wanted to draw attention to this question that J.A. Ginsburg, and I understand you're coming in from Chicago, so welcome. But takes an expanded definition of home to mean our planetary home, which I think is very appropriate. And then there's this list here of all the challenges that our planetary home is facing, from drought, epic drought in the West, the horrific floods in Germany that have killed over 100 people now. How has climate change impacted how you approach architecture? Buildings are not only made for now, but for decades into the future. What's climate change mean for you in your practice and your design thinking, Jonathan?
Well, no, David, it's interesting that you say that, because what I can't help but think about that is, I think one of the what did we call visionary ventures, the 10 outcomes of the pandemic. One of the things that has been talked about, a big part of why we face what we face is because of the imbalance of building, right? Because basically we built so much that's infringed upon, you call it the biodiversity or the kind of climates, and created, because we call it destroyed so much of the boundary between like a hard built thing and a natural environment, that you introduce like so much interaction between people and animals and diseases that like don't normally intersect. And then because we've also kind of homogenized it so much, right, where everybody loves being in a completely controlled 72-degree environment, we also don't have the capability physically to respond to being right adjacent to a community of bats, right? So a big part of what we faced was that. But I think so what does it mean for the way we practice? I think there's call it a fierce urgency of now and more than ever. We've talked about things like the 2030 climate challenge within architectural community, or the 2040 carbon challenge, which is coming in terms of reducing carbon, reducing energy, because buildings impact that so much. But then I think the other part of that is a struggle, because I get it here in Central Ohio, the perception of like, oh, I've learned this last year that I love my connection to nature and outdoor space. But what we need now more than ever is more of a concentration of development and buildings in urban cores, right? It's not so, we need, we're in this mode of like more than ever from an urban standpoint, we have to be focused on not the suburbs and moving further and further out, but how do we move more further in? And also how do we introduce, the balance of, natural climates within that, parks and trees and, all those things along with it. So we talk about it directly. I'm concerned because, it's really easy right now, where the counterpoint of what the mayor said is not wrong. We're at a time where everybody's like, hey, I don't want to live downtown. But now it's like probably more than ever is when we need to be having thoughtful conversations around how do we get more people to move into our urban core, as opposed to destroying the boundaries between the urban core and, more of a natural environment.
I couldn't let this go without comment, and I'm interested in your comment, Jonathan. So you said at the beginning of your talk that you weren't going to be using slides and PowerPoint and those sorts of things, and said you were going to use gesture. And I'm someone who is maybe overly sensitive to gesture and body language. People who've been watching me in various Zoom meetings will know that I go like this, and people who know ASL know what this means. But otherwise, they just think Staley's doing weird things with his hands, right? This is applause in American Sign Language, if you weren't already aware of that. Is this something that is a common part of the way you communicate or think, Jonathan? Do you think in terms of gesture and body language?
Well, I feel like not intentionally, and maybe that's kind of part of it. There are, but I think maybe Brian and Stacey know, I do have like this is also my hand gesture for when somebody wants a traditional thing. It's like, do they want one of these, or are they open to, and it really is more of a, I make hand gestures for, it helps me communicate, I would say.
I freak out my students because, as I say, I pay a lot of attention to body language. And students are often reticent to raise their hand in class, but they will make eye contact with you if they want to say something. And they don't realize they're doing it. I'm very, very sensitive to that. Well, we usually end the formal part of our presentation around this time, but we keep the Zoom room open for anyone who wants to stay. There's obviously more to discuss. I want to get to a question that Ron was raising here that you might be interested in, Jonathan. But before we do that, let me just first of all thank you, Jonathan, for such a wonderful talk this morning, and to get us all thinking differently about the meaning of home.